In the heart of Africa, a king loved his queen more than life itself. But when enemies kidnapped her, what happened next will shock you. Before we continue the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. The golden rays of the African sun poured over the sprawling palace, its walls rising high with intricate carvings that told stories of courage, love, and sacrifice. Within those walls lived King Adewale, a ruler admired not only for his wisdom and strength, but also for the deep affection he carried for his queen, Adewale. Their love was no secret. It radiated through every gesture, every glance, and every word they shared. The courtyards would often echo with laughter when the queen walked beside him, her hand lightly brushing against his, as though they were ordinary lovers in an extraordinary world. To the people of the kingdom, this love was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even with crowns and thrones, humanity's truest power lay in devotion. Yet, lurking in the shadows beyond the bright palace walls were enemies who despised not just the king's authority, but the joy he found in his queen. They whispered, they plotted, and they waited for the moment when their cruelty could strike the deepest wound. The queen was a woman of unmatched grace, not only admired for her beauty, but loved for her compassion. She walked among the people, listened to their troubles, and offered comfort in a way that made her more than a figure of royalty. She was their mother, their sister, their friend in times of sorrow. And for Adewale, she was the heart that beat alongside his, the steady voice that calmed him when the burdens of the throne weighed heavy on his shoulders. Many nights, he would rise from the throne room exhausted by disputes among nobles or threats from rival kingdoms, only to find her waiting in the garden, lantern in hand, smiling as if to remind him that he was never alone. In those moments, the king felt like more than a ruler. He was simply a man blessed beyond measure. But what the king did not know was that this bond, so pure and so celebrated, was also his greatest vulnerability, and his enemies would use it to pierce through his heart. The plot to steal away the queen unfolded on a night that seemed deceptively calm. The palace was alive with music, the drums echoing through the grand halls as nobles feasted in celebration of the harvest. Lanterns glowed, laughter rang, and the air was filled with joy. But outside the palace walls, the enemies advanced with silent precision, their steps hidden in the cloak of night. They had studied the guards, the weak points in the defenses, and most of all, the queen's habits. They knew she often walked in the eastern gardens when she grew tired of the noise inside. On this fateful evening, Adewale, with her gentle spirit, slipped away from the grand banquet to breathe in the cool air and admire the moonlit flowers. She did not notice the shadows moving closer, nor the glint of steel in the dark. Before she could call for help, rough hands silenced her voice, and in a matter of moments, the queen of the kingdom was stolen away, leaving only the crushed petals on the path as a trace of her disappearance. When the guards discovered her absence, chaos erupted. Cries echoed across the palace as the realization set in. The queen was gone. King Adewale, who had been raising his cup in cheer only moments before, felt the ground slip beneath his feet when the news reached him. His heart pounded with disbelief, his hands trembled as he demanded answers, and his booming voice shook the walls as he called for his men to search every corner. The torches lit the night as soldiers scattered into the forests and villages, their shouts piercing the silence. But no matter how far they searched, the queen was nowhere to be found. In the stillness that followed, the king sank onto his throne, his crown heavy with despair. For the first time in his reign, his people saw him not as an unshakable ruler, but as a man broken by grief. Yet in that moment of helplessness, when hope seemed to fade, destiny was quietly weaving another thread into the story, one that would come from the least expected place. Among the servants who lived within the palace walls was Jakir, a young man known for his quiet nature and diligent work. He had no noble blood, no armor to wear, no place among the warriors. But what he carried was loyalty, a heart that burned with devotion to the king and queen who had always treated him with kindness. When others whispered about the hopelessness of finding the queen, Jakir clenched his fists in defiance. To him, this was not just the loss of a queen. It was the loss of a motherly figure who had often spoken to him with warmth, asking about his family and encouraging him when he felt invisible. He could not sit idly by while the kingdom wept. So, when the palace grew silent, and even the king had retired into a restless grief, Jakir rose with determination. He would go where the soldiers could not, slip into the shadows where others feared, and bring back the queen. Not because he was commanded, but because his heart demanded it. Jakir's journey began at dawn, when the sun cast its first light upon the kingdom. He carried no weapon but a small dagger, no armor but his resolve. With each step, he replayed the stories he had overheard, the whispers of the king's enemies, the merchants who had spoken of unusual movements near the border, and the strange silence in villages that once thrived. His path was uncertain, his odds slim, yet he pressed on with courage that outshone the glitter of any knight's sword. In the forests, he listened to the rustling leaves, alert for danger. In the villages, he asked questions, piecing together fragments of truth. And though the world seemed vast and dangerous, he felt a strange strength growing within him, as if the queen's spirit guided his steps. For Jakir, this was no longer a servant's duty. It was destiny calling him to rise beyond his station. The kingdom did not know it yet, but in the humble figure of Jakir, their salvation was already on its way. Jakir's journey carried him deeper into the wild landscapes that stretched beyond the safety of the kingdom. And with every step, the air grew heavier with danger. He had never been so far from the palace walls before, yet his determination fueled him like fire, keeping his heart steady when fear tried to creep in. The forest was alive with sounds, chirping insects, the distant cry of birds, and the crackle of dry branches under his feet. But beneath these natural voices lay an eerie silence, a silence that spoke of enemies watching from the shadows. Jakir tightened his grip on his dagger, his eyes darting across the trees as if the darkness itself would leap forward to stop him. What weighed most heavily on his heart was the thought of Queen Adewale, perhaps frightened and alone, waiting for someone to come for her. That thought alone burned away his fear, replacing it with courage that surprised even him. He was just a servant, untrained in the art of war, but his loyalty was stronger than steel, and in that loyalty lay the seed of bravery. By midday, Jakir reached a village near the border, a place he remembered visiting once with merchants who supplied goods to the palace. But the sight that greeted him now was unsettling. The streets were quiet, too quiet for a place that once bustled with life. The houses looked abandoned, the doors shut tightly, and smoke no longer rose from the chimneys. His heart raced as he walked further, scanning every corner, calling softly to see if anyone remained. Then, from the shadows of an old hut, an elderly woman emerged, her eyes wide with fear. She beckoned him closer and whispered of soldiers who had come in the night. Men carrying weapons not of their kingdom, men who took people away and silenced anyone who resisted. Jakir listened intently, piecing the puzzle together. When he asked about the queen, the woman lowered her voice even more and pointed toward the mountains in the east, warning him that the enemies had built a camp there. It was dangerous, she said, too dangerous for a young man like him to approach. But Jakir bowed deeply, thanked her for her courage, and vowed to return with the queen or not return at all. The path to the mountains tested every ounce of his willpower. The sun blazed overhead, scorching the earth beneath his feet, while sharp rocks tore at his sandals. His body ached, his throat grew dry, and yet he pressed on, driven by a vision in his mind. The queen's smile, her voice filled with kindness, the way she carried herself with dignity. He remembered the day she had asked about his mother's health, even though he was just a servant who poured water at the banquet table. That memory became his strength. As he climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the forest gave way to rocky terrain. From the distance, he spotted the faint flicker of fire and the black smoke rising against the clear blue sky. His heart skipped a beat. This had to be the camp of the enemies. Jakir crouched low behind the stones, his breathing shallow as he crawled closer to get a better view. And there it was, the queen, bound but unbroken, standing tall in the midst of her captors. Rage and sorrow flooded Jakir's heart, but with them came resolve. He had found her, and now came the hardest part, bringing her home. From his hiding place, Jakir studied the camp with the eyes of a hunter. The enemies were many, more than he had ever faced or even imagined. Their armor gleamed under the sun, their swords rested by their sides, and their laughter echoed like the growls of beasts. He knew rushing in would mean certain death, not just for him, but for the queen as well. He needed a plan, a strategy born not of strength, but of wit. Hours passed as he watched their movements, memorizing their routines. He noticed that as night approached, the guards closest to the queen grew careless, distracted by their own drinking and boasting. This would be his chance. When the sky turned to shades of purple and gold, and the first stars appeared above, Jakir whispered a prayer to the gods of his ancestors. He tightened his grip on his dagger, pressed his forehead against the cool stone beneath him, and promised himself that he would not leave without her. Fear gnawed at his soul, but the fire of loyalty burned brighter, guiding him like a torch in the darkness. As night fully settled, Jakir moved like a shadow among shadows. His steps were silent, his body pressed low to the ground, his eyes sharp as an eagle's. He slipped past two guards who were too busy laughing to notice the servant boy creeping near. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he feared it would give him away. But he pressed on, inch by inch, until he was within reach of the queen. Her eyes widened when she saw him, a flicker of recognition lighting up her weary face. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, then carefully began to cut through the ropes that bound her wrists. Every second felt like an eternity. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was doing. The queen, sensing his determination, stood still and calm, her strength lending him courage. When the final rope fell, he whispered softly, "My queen, we must move quickly." But just as he prepared to lead her away, the crack of a branch beneath his foot betrayed them. The enemies turned, their eyes narrowing in suspicion, and in that instant, Jakir knew the true test of his courage had arrived. The alarm rang out like thunder as the camp exploded into chaos. Torches flared, swords were drawn, and shouts filled the air as the enemies rushed toward the queen and her rescuer. Jakir grabbed her hand and pulled her into the shadows, his heart racing as he searched desperately for a way out. They ran across the uneven ground, stumbling, dodging, weaving between tents and fires, the heat of pursuit burning at their backs. Jakir's dagger flashed as he fended off a soldier who lunged at them, the clash of steel ringing in the night. Though untrained, desperation made him fierce, his strikes fueled by the single purpose of protecting the queen. They darted toward the edge of the camp, the forest just within reach, freedom only steps away. But with every stride, more enemies closed in, their voices echoing through the night like wolves on the hunt. Jakir tightened his grip on the queen's hand, whispering through clenched teeth, "We will make it, my queen. Hold on." And though the odds loomed against them, he felt a surge of strength he had never known before. This was no longer the act of a servant. This was the rise of a hero. The forest swallowed them in its vast, dark arms, the towering trees bending under the weight of silence, broken only by the crashing footsteps of their pursuers. Jakir dragged the queen through tangled roots and low branches, his breath ragged, his heart hammering as though it would burst from his chest. The glow of torches flickered behind them, growing brighter with every passing second, and the shouts of soldiers carried through the night like the roar of a storm. He knew the forest gave them cover, but it also threatened to betray them with every snap of twigs beneath their feet. Yet, despite the danger, Jakir felt a strange clarity guiding his every move. He no longer saw himself as a servant running blindly into doom. He was a guardian, a shield between his queen and the jaws of death. Adewale, though weary and bound by exhaustion, moved with a grace that spoke of her unbroken spirit. She whispered prayers under her breath, prayers that mingled with the rhythm of their running steps. And in that union of desperation and faith, a fire stronger than fear was born. The chase had only begun, but Jakir knew they could not keep running forever. They needed a plan, a chance to outsmart their enemies before the forest became their grave. The night deepened, stars shimmering faintly overhead, their cold light filtering through the branches as though heaven itself was watching. Jakir pulled the queen toward a rocky incline, urging her to climb with him, their fingers clawing into the earth as they hauled themselves higher. Below, the torches scattered, forming a river of light that surged and spread, soldiers determined to close in on every corner of the woods. From their perch, Jakir studied the movements, his mind racing. He noticed that while the soldiers were many, their strength was in numbers, not in unity. They scattered too widely, eager to claim victory alone, leaving pockets of darkness between their ranks. That darkness was Jakir's ally. "We move through the shadows," he whispered, his voice rough but steady. "Step where I step. Do not falter." The queen nodded, her eyes blazing with courage, and together they slipped down the far side of the hill, sliding into a narrow valley that smelled of moss and damp earth. Every stone beneath Jakir's palm, every breath of cold air in his lungs, carried the weight of destiny. He was not trained, yet he was learning, every heartbeat teaching him how to fight not with swords but with cunning, with faith, with the unyielding fire of loyalty. The queen, seeing this transformation, placed her trust entirely in him, her silence speaking louder than any words. Hours passed like years as they wove through the labyrinth of trees, doubling back to confuse their hunters, hiding beneath thickets when the enemy drew too near. Jakir's body screamed with exhaustion, but his spirit refused to bend. He thought of the palace, the laughter of children in the courtyards, the songs sung during feasts, the warm light of the queen's presence that kept despair away. He thought of what would happen if he failed. Chains around her wrists forever, a kingdom that would wither without its heart. That thought drove him forward. Yet fate, cruel as ever, did not intend for their path to remain hidden for long. As dawn painted the horizon with pale light, a horn blared in the distance, sharp and thunderous, calling the scattered soldiers back into unity. Jakir froze, his blood turning to ice. The forest trembled with the sound of renewed pursuit, and within moments, the glow of 100 torches began to converge, swallowing the dark sanctuary they had carved for themselves. The queen placed a hand on Jakir's shoulder, her touch soft yet firm, and whispered, "Do not be afraid. We are not alone in this forest. The gods walk with those who walk with courage." Her words, simple and serene, poured strength into him, reminding him that even in the face of armies, one heart ablaze with loyalty could shine like fire in the night. The enemies drew closer, their chants and shouts rising like waves crashing against the shore. Jakir knew the moment of decision had come. He turned to the queen, his voice urgent but resolute. "My queen, I will not let them take you. Whatever happens, you must survive, for the kingdom needs you." She shook her head fiercely, her eyes burning with both defiance and love for her people. "No, Jakir. We survive together, or we do not survive at all. Your courage has carried us this far. Do not falter now." Those words struck him like steel striking flint, igniting a flame that blazed through every vein of his body. He tightened his grip on his dagger, though small and worn, and drew himself to his full height. He no longer felt like the servant boy who once poured water at the banquet tables. He was a protector, chosen by fate in the crucible of fire. As the first wave of enemies broke through the trees, their armor gleaming in the newborn light, Jakir positioned himself before the queen, ready to stand against them. His heart thundered, not with fear, but with the roar of destiny. This was the moment he had been walking toward all along. The moment where a servant could rise as a warrior, where loyalty would be tested against the storm of steel. The clash was inevitable, a storm about to erupt in the heart of the forest. Torches flared, swords gleamed, and shouts shook the air as the soldiers rushed forward, their eyes fixed on the prize they believed was already theirs. But Jakir, with nothing more than a dagger and a heart unwilling to bow, stood as a wall between them and the queen. Every instinct told him he would not survive, yet every breath reminded him why he fought. His voice broke through the chaos, low but firm, carrying a promise not just to his queen but to himself, to the kingdom, to the very soil beneath his feet. You will not take her. Not while I draw breath. And in that instant, the forest seemed to lean closer, the trees bearing witness, the earth itself holding its breath. The first soldier lunged, and Jakir moved to meet him, his blade flashing, his spirit roaring louder than the clash of steel. Behind him, Queen Adewale lifted her chin, her presence unyielding, her faith in him unbroken. Whatever the outcome, this battle would not be remembered as the fall of a servant, but as the rise of a protector. The dawn blazed brighter, the world trembled, and the story of Jakir, the servant who defied destiny, surged into legend with every strike, every breath, every heartbeat. The clash tore through the silence of dawn, the sound of metal striking metal echoing across the forest like thunder. Jakir lunged forward, his dagger flashing in the pale light, meeting the first soldier with a force born not of strength, but of desperation and unshakable loyalty. The soldier staggered, surprised by the ferocity of a man he thought was nothing more than a servant. The queen, standing just behind him, gasped but did not falter. Her eyes burned with faith, and her spirit became Jakir's shield as much as the dagger in his hand. The soldiers circled, their torches creating a ring of fire around them, each flame a reminder that escape was slipping away. Yet Jakir did not cower. He slashed, ducked, struck again, his movements clumsy, but driven by an unrelenting fire. His body burned with exhaustion, but his will screamed louder than the clash of swords. For every strike he blocked, for every cut that grazed his skin, he whispered within himself, "Not while I draw breath." And the forest, the trees, the sky above, seemed to echo his vow as though destiny itself had bent down to listen. The second wave of enemies surged forward, blades raised, their voices roaring in unison. Jakir braced himself, his body trembling under the weight of the fight, but his spirit unbroken. He spun, dodging one strike, countering another, his dagger slicing through the chaos like a whisper of defiance. Yet the odds pressed heavier with every passing moment. Blood trickled down his arm from a shallow wound, his chest heaved with ragged breaths, and still the soldiers closed in. The queen, though unarmed, refused to stand idle. Her voice, clear and commanding, rose above the din. "Do not let him fall. This man stands for his king. This man fights for his queen." Her words rang like steel through the air, halting the advance of some, shaking the certainty of others. Jakir glanced back at her for the briefest moment, her strength pouring into his weary limbs. He fought harder, faster, his dagger a blur, his stance that of a man who had decided that death would not come cheaply. The soldiers faltered, realizing this was no ordinary servant. They faced something greater, something they could not name but could feel in the marrow of their bones. Yet destiny, cruel and relentless, demanded more. As Jakir fought, the leader of the enemy band stepped forward, a towering figure draped in black armor that glistened like oil under the torchlight. His eyes, cold and sharp, pierced through the chaos and fixed on Jakir with disdain. "So this is the rat who dares defy me," he sneered, drawing a blade longer than Jakir's entire arm. The air seemed to thicken, silence crawling in as soldiers stepped back to make space. The queen's breath caught in her throat, and Jakir's fingers tightened on his dagger, though he knew it was little against such a weapon. Still, he did not step back. "You will not take her," he growled, his voice low but steady. The commander laughed, a sound that dripped with arrogance and cruelty, and advanced. Their blades met with a crash that shook Jakir's bones, the force nearly knocking him to his knees. But he held firm, teeth gritted, eyes blazing. Strike after strike fell upon him, each heavier than the last, and yet he blocked, twisted, endured. The forest floor became their battlefield, sparks flying as steel met steel, sweat and blood mingling with the earth beneath their feet. It was not skill that held Jakir upright, but the unyielding force of loyalty. The fire of a servant turned protector. The queen's prayers turned into cries, her voice breaking as she watched Jakir stumble, his body battered, his dagger barely holding against the commander's onslaught. The soldiers roared with each blow, convinced the end was near, that victory was already theirs. But just when the commander raised his blade for the final strike, something within Jakir ignited, a flame brighter than fear, stronger than pain. With a cry that shook the trees, he surged forward, ducking beneath the commander's swing, and drove his dagger deep into the gap beneath the man's armor. The commander gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and staggered back, his blade slipping from his grip. Silence fell. The soldiers froze, disbelief etched across their faces. Jakir stood trembling, bloodied and exhausted, his chest heaving as though each breath was torn from the edge of death itself. The commander collapsed, the ground shaking with the weight of his fall. For a heartbeat, the forest held its breath. And then, chaos erupted. The soldiers, once so certain of victory, now faltered, their leader slain by the very man they mocked. Some fled into the shadows, their courage broken. Others hesitated, unwilling to advance against a man who had just carved legend into the soil. But victory did not come without cost. Jakir's body swayed, the strength that had carried him drained away. His dagger slipped from his fingers, falling to the earth with a dull thud. The queen rushed forward, catching him before he could collapse fully, her arms trembling as she held him. "Jakir, you cannot fall." "Not now," she whispered, tears streaking down her face. He managed a weak smile, his voice little more than a rasp. "My queen, you are safe. That is all that matters." She pressed her forehead against his, her heart breaking at his pain, but her spirit soaring with pride. Around them, the forest grew still once more, the retreat of enemies echoing into the distance. Jakir had done the impossible. He had not only saved his queen but struck fear into those who dared threaten her. And as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the horizon, painting the world in gold, a new chapter of destiny was written. The servant had risen, not just as a protector, but as the beating heart of a kingdom's hope. The queen, holding him close, vowed silently that the king would know of this bravery, and that Jakir's name would never be forgotten. In the stillness of dawn, amidst the blood and ashes of battle, the seeds of legend had been sown. The dawn stretched wide over the kingdom, golden light spilling across the palace walls, as though the heavens themselves had decided to honor the courage that had unfolded in the night. The queen, exhausted yet unbroken, leaned heavily on Jakir as they made their way through the dense forest path back toward the palace. Her arm supported him, though he insisted with quiet dignity that he could walk on his own. His body was battered, his clothes torn, streaks of blood still fresh on his skin. Yet his spirit stood taller than the tallest tower in the kingdom. Every step was a testament to survival, every breath a hymn to loyalty. The forest, now silent after the chaos of battle, seemed to bow in reverence, the leaves whispering stories that only nature could tell. And as they neared the clearing where the palace gates came into view, the queen's eyes welled with tears, not of sorrow, but of triumph. She knew what had been lost, but she also knew what had been gained. A servant who had risked all and written his name into the book of destiny. Jakir's silence spoke louder than words, his gaze fixed on the palace as though he carried not just his wounds, but also the weight of an entire kingdom's hope. At the palace gates, the guards gasped in disbelief. For hours, whispers had filled the marble halls. Rumors of the queen's capture, fears of the king's wrath, prayers whispered into the night for her safe return. And now, as the gates swung wide and the queen stepped forward with Jakir at her side, the air erupted in cries of joy. Soldiers knelt, servants wept, noblemen clutched their chests in awe. The queen, regal despite her disheveled gown, raised her hand, silencing the crowd with a single gesture. "We return not because fate was kind," she declared, her voice ringing through the courtyard, "but because courage was greater than fear. This man, Jakir, once a servant among you, became my shield, my sword, and my salvation. Without him, I would not stand before you today." Gasps rippled through the crowd, their eyes shifting toward Jakir, who stood swaying on his feet, humbled and uncomfortable with such praise. But the truth could not be denied. He was no longer merely a servant. He was the reason their queen had returned alive. Words spread like wildfire through the palace, each corner whispering his name, each heart swelling with gratitude. Yet the greatest test still awaited. The king himself, who had spent the night in torment, pacing his throne room, haunted by visions of his beloved lost forever. The great doors to the throne room creaked open, and silence swept over the hall. Adewale, the king, sat upon his golden throne, his face pale with sleeplessness, his hands trembling though his posture remained tall and dignified. His eyes, weary yet burning, lifted at the sound of approaching footsteps. And then, at last, he saw her, his queen, his love, alive. Tears broke through the iron of his restraint, and he rose, running down the steps of his throne like a man released from chains. He embraced her tightly, his lips pressing against her hair, his sobs echoing in the chamber. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of despair turned to relief. She smiled faintly, holding his face between her hands. "You almost did. But he," she turned and gestured toward Jakir, "stood against death itself and brought me back to you." The king's gaze fell upon Jakir, and for a moment, silence hung heavy. Jakir lowered his head, bowing deeply, his body trembling with fatigue. "Your Majesty, I did only what loyalty demanded," he murmured. The king, however, stepped forward, placing his hand upon Jakir's shoulder. "No, Jakir, you did what legends are made of. Tonight, the crown does not stand because of me. It stands because of you." The hall filled with gasps, nobles whispering furiously, unable to comprehend the sight of a king lowering himself before a servant. But Adewale's heart had been reshaped by the fire of fear, and gratitude poured from him without hesitation. The queen, radiant despite her ordeal, lifted her chin and spoke with fierce pride. "Our kingdom must know the truth. This man's name shall not fade into silence. His sacrifice, his courage, his loyalty, these must be carved into the very stone of our palace." The king nodded, his voice booming through the chamber as he declared, "From this day forth, Jakir shall no longer serve as a mere hand within these walls. He shall stand at my side, not beneath me. He shall serve not as a servant, but as a wazir, my trusted advisor, a guardian of this throne and of the queen who means more to me than life itself." The hall erupted in stunned silence, then slowly applause spread. Hesitant at first, then thunderous, echoing against the vaulted ceilings. Jakir's eyes widened in disbelief, his heart pounding. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined such honor. He dropped to one knee, tears streaming down his battered face. "Your Majesty, I am unworthy," he choked out. The king lifted him to his feet. "You are not only worthy, you are necessary. A kingdom without men like you is a kingdom destined to fall." And in that moment, under the golden glow of dawn streaming through the tall windows, the servant was reborn. As the days unfolded, the story of Jakir's bravery spread beyond the palace walls, carried by travelers, sung by bards, whispered in marketplaces and fields. Children repeated his tale with wide eyes. Mothers spoke of his courage to inspire their sons, and men nodded with respect whenever his name was uttered. The king, true to his word, placed Jakir at his side during councils, trusting his wisdom as much as his loyalty. The queen, ever grateful, treated him not as a subject, but as a brother in spirit, her bond with him forged in fire and unbreakable. The nobles, though some resented his rise, could not deny the strength he brought to the throne. And Jakir, though clothed now in fine robes and seated among the highest, never forgot where he had come from. He walked through the palace gardens with humility. He spoke to servants as equals, and he carried himself not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength of a man who had seen death and chosen life for others. His rise was not one of ambition, but of destiny, shaped by loyalty and sealed by love. The kingdom itself seemed to glow brighter under the weight of this newfound unity. Where once fear of enemies lingered, now faith in loyalty flourished. The people, inspired by Jakir's story, found hope in the idea that greatness could come not from birth or crown, but from the heart of an ordinary man. The king, softened and humbled by the near loss of his queen, became wiser, more compassionate, ruling not just with power but with empathy. The queen, her spirit strengthened by her ordeal, stood taller than ever, guiding her people with a grace that spoke louder than words. And at the heart of it all stood Jakir, the servant turned wazir, the unlikely hero whose courage had reshaped the course of history. Together, they created a kingdom that did not simply survive but thrived, a kingdom whose legacy would echo through generations. The dawn that had once risen over blood and ashes now rose over peace and prosperity, its light reflecting the truth that sometimes the smallest flame can burn brighter than the sun.